Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. We're just going to let folks stream in a bit. All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kendra Kerr. I'm the Manager of Partnerships and Projects with the MLSE Foundation. And we're here again with our monthly community learning series. Today, we're talking about trust-based philanthropy. I'm going to kick things off with a bit of housekeeping and then throw it to our panelists, the moderator. So I want to start by acknowledging that our organizations, the Laidlaw Foundation, Inspirit Foundation, and MLSE Foundation stand on the traditional territory of many nations, including multiple Mississaugas, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. And it continues to be home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. This land has been governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt for 1,000 years, and in recent times by Williams Treaty and Treaty 13. I encourage you to learn more about the traditional lands in which you sit, and we'll post a link to a website where you can find out exactly what that is. As settler organizations, the recognition of the contributions of Indigenous communities is connected to our commitment to truth and reconciliation. And we strongly believe that advancing Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation are deeply and inextricably linked to one another, and we remain committed to advancing both. We're going to be recording this session, and it'll be posted on our community learning series website for you to visit after the fact. If you have any comments or questions, please put them in our Q&A or chat feature, and we'll do our best to incorporate them into the session today. If you have any IT issues, again, feel free to put it in the chat or email foundationgrants@mlse.com, and we can try and help you troubleshoot. And after no further ado, I want to introduce our moderator for today. Liban Abukor is the Executive Director of Youth Leaps, a Toronto-based nonprofit organization that supports Black youth to improve their education and employment outcomes. Liban is the founding member of Ontario's first ever Premier Council on Youth Opportunities, which helped enhance Ontario's Youth Action Plan, establish the Youth Opportunity Fund, and Black Youth Action Plan, pardon me. He's an active volunteer with the philanthropic sector as a board member for various foundations, including the Laidlaw Foundation, where he chaired their granting committee, and the Kathleen Donnelly Foundation. And most recently, Liban co-authored the groundbreaking research report, Unfunded, Black Communities Overlooked by Canadian Philanthropy, and is currently a member of the working group establishing the Foundation for Black Communities. So welcome, Liban, and I'll let you introduce our other panelists.
Thank you so much, Kendra, for that important line acknowledgement and the generous introduction. And greetings to everyone in attendance today. First, I'll introduce our distinguished panelists. So actually, let me go back. I'll do 3 quick things before we start the session today. First, I'll introduce our distinguished panelists. Second, I'll go over the schedule for today. I'm sure it'll look pretty standard to you webinar warriors. And finally, I'll outline a brief background with some of the key takeaways that we're hoping to achieve in today's webinar. Sound good? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Sounds great.
Okay, great. Then let's begin. In no particular order, I'll quickly introduce our panel members. First, we have Tanya Mrock. Tanya is currently the Executive Director of the MLSE Foundation and MLSE Launchpad. She's been a sports and social responsibility strategist for 15 years. Her journey towards sports philanthropy includes stops in community relations, player programs, and communications and marketing. And since 2010, she's invested over $45 million in charitable, in charitable dollars to support youth facing barriers on behalf of Toronto Argos, Toronto FC, Maple Leafs, and my very own Toronto Raptors. Steering the foundation towards strategic and sustainable programming to maximize impact, Tanya is the champion behind MLSE Launchpad, the first facility in North America dedicated to youth development in the community, combining sport, education, and research to address social issues. Tanya was also recently elected chair of the Canadian Women in Sport. Welcome, Tanya. Nice to have you with us today. Second, we have Second, we have Sadia Saman. Sadia brings a wealth of arts, media, and not-for-profit experience to her role as CEO of Inspirit Foundation. Before joining Inspirit, Sadia was a managing director of ROM Canada at the Royal Ontario Museum, where she focused on digital content and amplifying Indigenous narratives. Before the ROM, Sadia commissioned documentary and current affair projects from across the country as director of original program development at CBC News and Centres. She also led Women in Film and Television Toronto, a not-for-profit that supports training and the advancement of women in screen-based industry. Sadia began her career as a journalist, creating hundreds of hours of original critically acclaimed current affairs and documentary content for Vision TV, CBC, and TVO. Sadia has also won dozens of awards for her journalism and has been honored for her leadership. She sits on many juries and advisory committees and is often sought to speak about media, arts, equity, gender, and leadership, and so much more. Finally, and not least, we have Jihad Eliwewi. Jihad is a strategic thinker with nearly 20 years of experience in senior management in positions in social, settlement, and community service organizations. Since 2014, Jihad has held the position of executive director with the Laidlaw Foundation. For 10 years before that, Jihad was executive director with Thorncliffe Neighborhood Office, a multi-service not-for-profit organization serving the Thorncliffe and surrounding communities. Prior to that, he was a regional director, Metro Region of Catholic Cross-Cultural Services. Jihad has also worked with the Canadian Arab Federation for 8 years as a race relations officer, later as executive director. He is a trustee at the Ontario Science Centre and a board member of the Ontario Science Centre and a board member of Fred Victor Services and the Canadian Council for Refugees. He also served on the board for the Ontario Council, the agency serving immigrants, OCASI, and the Toronto Neighborhood Centres. In 2010, Jihad was a recipient of the Local Hero Award from the Canadian Urban Institute. The mouthful for all of these three bios is just simply to say they're people worth listening to, so tune in carefully. In terms of our schedule, the session is going to be in two parts. The first will be a 30-minute moderated conversation with the panelists, followed by a 10 to 15-minute Q&A from the audience. Now, for a brief background on the session today and some key takeaways. Our philanthropy sector in Canada has a lot to be proud of. We've seen the crucial role our sector can play in reinforcing our social safety net during periods of great distress, such as the unprecedented pandemic, the economic downturn, and the global awakening around racial and social inequality in the last year alone. However, this year has also revealed how structural and systematic practices in our sector continue to frustrate our attempts to address the lack of diversity in our leadership, decision-making, and the resulting funding practices which disadvantage members of some segments of Canadians, including Black, Indigenous, and people of color. For example, the recent unfunded report revealed how traditional philanthropy in Canada created and maintained a blind spot on Black communities. The report echoed what many in our sector have been calling for, which is a greater adoption and implementation of trust-based philanthropy. At its core, trust-based philanthropy is about redistributing power systematically, organizationally, and interpersonally in service of a healthier and more equitable not-for-profit, charitable, and philanthropic sector. On a practical level, when you'll hear from our esteemed guests, you'll hear about things like the multi-year unrestricted funding, streamlined applications, reporting, and a commitment to building relationships based on transparency, dialogue, and mutual learning. We hope that this conversation is going to enable everyone here today to learn about trust-based philanthropy, both in theory and practice. We'll be wrestling with some questions such as why this approach to philanthropy is important and required to meet the challenges of today. Finally, our aim is for people to leave with a better understanding of how and why some of the panelists here and their organizations have incorporated trust-based philanthropy in their work. We hope that the case study you'll hear about today, which is the investment in the Foundation for Black Communities, provides you with some practical examples that can help you on your own journey as your respective groups and organizations embrace or further incorporate the use of trust-based philanthropy. Now, with that said, to our moderated portion of the panel. Here we go. First question. describe what trust-based philanthropy means to your organization and how does that work? Sadia, why don't you tee us off?
Sure. Liban, actually, you touched on a number of these things, but at its core, it's about power and it's about agency and it's about self-determination. And I guess on some level, it's hard to do that without relationships. And, you know, when you talk about trust, there can be no trust without those relationships and that relationship building. And I think one of the issues that is really, really tough for the sector is, who do we have relationships with? Who are the people that are within our orbit? Who are the people who are part of our families? Who are the people who are part of our neighborhoods? And the closer we are to people who we need to work with, the easier it is to develop that trust. And the easier it is to let go of notions of power and control. And the easier it is to think about agency as being totally natural and something that all of us should want for everybody.
Thank you. Jihad, why don't we go to you next? Same question. What's trust-based philanthropy means to you, your organization, and how does it work?
Well, in addition to what Sadia said, I think in my view, at its core, it's about what community needs and asks for, and not about what philanthropy likes and want to fund. And I think the relationship piece is key, and who's forming those relationships, as Sadia mentioned. So it is important that we know that it is about building relationships, and then trust comes with that. But who is in charge of building these relationships? Who's the face and the voice of an organization that is able to go out there and build these important relationships? And if it remains to be the same group of people who are making decisions on grants and allocations, it will continue to be relationships with the same group of people. So I think in addition to everything else, I think it is about who's also in charge of forging these relationships. But it's taking the lead from community, being genuine about listening, and it is about what the community needs and not what philanthropist. There is philanthropy fetishism that we need to move away from and start thinking about what is needed and what is relevant.
Tanya, you just heard your colleagues talk about relationship building. They just talked a little bit about power sharing. What about you? What does trust-based philanthropy mean to you, MLSE Foundation? What does it mean to you, and how does it work when you practice it?
I think for me, everything that's been said already is true. And then it also helps me achieve our objectives of sustainable and equitable funding. And we talked about relationships and responding to community need. And we identified that there's a knowledge gap for us there in regards to understanding those communities. And this pathway of trust-based philanthropy builds those relationships, so we have a deeper understanding of community need and how to create that equitable and sustainable access to funds.
Thank you. Second question, I think it kind of builds on the first one here. How is trust-based philanthropy a shift in what traditionally happens in funding relationships at your organization? And are there challenges? Why don't we start with you, Tanya, and then we'll go to you next, Jihad, and then Sadia, you can bring us home.
Definitely. I think one of the major shifts was, the approach of equity. So previously, our approach was everything the same. Give everyone the same opportunity to apply, to go through the same portal, to go through the same governance method, to be adjudicated by the same people. And we didn't get that broad base of applications that we were looking for. There were groups that just weren't applying. And you could defer that and be like, well, it's open, they can apply if they want. But we didn't go further. Did they know about the process? Do they know how to apply? Does this actually meet their need, the way we're distributing grants? We're giving people maybe, let's say, a $50,000 grant, but this community organization only needs 5, so they might not apply. And they've already selected themselves out of the process. So for us, it was taking a deep look on, are we really doing the best we can in funding our community? You talk about power shifting. We thought, we know what we're doing. We look at what other folks are doing. It must be working. We're putting money in the hands of the community, but is it the right way? And is it meeting what they want? But, as Jihad said, it was more like we're meeting our need, hitting our deliverables, our numbers, and not really reframing it the other way.
Sadia, any thoughts to what Tanya just shared, or separate from?
Yeah, it is so interesting that whole equity piece is an ongoing process, right? So within all sorts of communities, there are also tiers of power. And where it gets really, really interesting is that the complexity there is something that I think is harder to access or possibly understand. And Tanya, I could be totally out of left field here, if you're not from a racialized community yourself, right? And I think that presents a particular barrier actually to white leaders, and one that that the system has to wrestle with in terms of not being afraid of the complexity that is inherent within the diversity. I think sometimes there's a little bit of fear around talking about some of those issues and about being very honest about what people don't know. And that absolutely affects who we trust and who we grant to and who gets access and all of those pieces.
Sadia, Tanya, I'm going to come back to you because I think I want to build a little bit on some of the things you talked about. Specifically, what are the actual shifts? What are some of the tangible shifts we're seeing? I want you to take a moment, think about those while Jihad answers, and then I want to come back and pick this question back up with you a little bit more. Jihad, why don't you take a shot at this question? How is trust-based philanthropy a shift in what traditionally happens?
Well, I think traditional philanthropy is really by its definition, it really is a very traditional, antiquated model of making, decisions on how do we improve the lot of these people that we want to really help. And it really is very, very deeply embedded in the practices around, decision making. The shift is, and it's not an easy process. It's not a one time, and it's, people throw the word messy a lot to talk about something very serious, but it really is, and it really takes a lot of process. And there is, again, is not one way of doing it. And I am always reminded by the very sage words of Groucho. One of the Groucho brothers said, "These are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others," which basically means you try and you fail and you try to do. But if you start with saying that, yes, philanthropy has an inherent imbalances of power and influence built in it, because there is money that is going out. It is that process. And the better we understand that distance between the money we have and the deployment process, this is where the shifts need to happen. Because at the end, these foundations have assets that are tax sheltered. And by definition, these are public assets. And I think that's how we start the conversation. Someone said the pandemic has showed us the kind of government we desire and we deserve because of the many programs that the governments have put forward to support communities. And I think I would say that this is also a moment for us to say, this is what kind of philanthropy we desire and we need, one that is conscious of its power, acknowledges it and put it at the front and say, there's nothing we can do about it. Yes, it's there, but this is how we're dealing with this. This is how we are connecting to communities and taking the lead from community. So it's basically distributing public asset to the public. It shouldn't be rocket science. The public should be involved in the conversation.
So I'm going to come back 30 seconds to both you and Tanya. Sadia, let's begin with you. We just heard the shift in traditional philanthropy is taking lead from communities. What does that mean or look like for you, Sadia? And then that same question to you, Tanya.
Well, at its very basic, it means unrestricted granting, and it means very little reporting in the traditional ways, a lot of conversations, a process that is in some ways much more time intensive, but much more relationship building involved in the process, but the shift away from, Jihad is absolutely right. If you think of the monies that any foundation has as being held in public trust, as someone who has worked primarily at public institutions, for me, like this is a fairly straightforward concept, and so that implies access, and it implies a responsibility actually to distribute those assets in a way that are in line with your mandate and your mission.
So from my perspective, I'm just going to touch on two things. I think one of the first things we did as an organization, which was a significant change, was releasing decision power from being fully internal, driven by staff and board. So even setting up a committee, one of our first steps a few years ago, to help us adjudicate grants was a big deal. And we had to explain and position it because people were afraid we're allowing others to make decisions with our money. And that just reinforces the whole systemic barriers and the colonization of wealth. So that was the first step. Coming from a corporate charity, we had to work through that. The second step was, as we talked about, partnering with an organization and sharing power to ensure that wealth is being distributed to the communities we want. So for us, that was partnering with Foundation for Black Communities and allowing them to guide our strategy and support it, because we are not experts in this space, and really understanding that humility that we must trust others to help us achieve our goals.
I think that's a perfect segment to the next conversation or question. Each of your organizations, Inspirit, MLSE Foundation, and Laidlaw, has made a significant investment in the Foundation for Black Communities. You've heard our call for a transfer of capital so that really community can lead its own decision-making, its own investments. And you put out a call for other funding organizations to follow. Why now? And what do you think that would mean? Jihad, why don't we start with you?
I think why now is better late than never. This is a conversation that should have happened maybe 50 years ago or so. But I think it's timely. Obviously, everybody's talking about the pandemic as it's the starting point of everything. But the pandemic highlighted a number of issues: inequality and inequity, and how something as global as a pandemic and a public health crisis have expressed itself in communities that are already experiencing, challenges, difficulties, and systemic barriers. So this is the time to do it. We were presented by a very compelling vision, a vision that really also didn't take away from our own ability to do what we're supposed to be doing to begin with. So it wasn't against our strategic priorities, but we also started saying that it doesn't matter what issue area you are interested in. And this is directly for my colleagues on the webinar who are struggling with how to present this to their board. How do we deal with the mission fit and not to, and focus on the things that we're supposed to be doing? And we told our board we want to do these are our priorities. No matter what is your issue areas, Black and Indigenous and other minorities are impacted directly by this. Every aspect of society that we care about has a direct link to how these communities are systematically excluded. So there isn't really no other way around it other than to really acknowledge that this is an opportunity and a moment in time where we need to really be courageous and bold. And there is a lot of work that we need to do with our boards, with our stakeholders, to make sure that they are supportive and they're convinced, and the compelling vision that was presented by Foundation for Black Communities has provided us with the case for support and really an opportunity to be deeply connected to communities in a way that we haven't in the past. As an organization, we pride ourselves in being diverse at all levels of the organizations, from governance to staffing to some form of decision-making at our granting allocation. Not perfect, but we're getting there. This still represented a fresh, new, and meaningful way of getting to the communities that we know we want to connect and partner with.
Sadia, you just heard Jihad speak a little bit about a lot of things there. Anything stick out at you? Anything that you thought, yeah, I totally agree, maybe not? Want to add?
Well, I think the why now question is a crucial question. You know, there are things happening in the world. We've all seen what inequity looks like. Some of us have lived it in various different ways, depending on our social location, our geographic location as well. And of course, the race, religion, ethnicity pieces are huge in terms of how we experience the world as well. And I think on some level, you know, Jihad, it's interesting because I hear you, your board, very much anti-Black racism is one of your priority areas. In our case, it's more, you know, a broader kind of goal around pluralism and making sure that people feel like there is an ability to lean in and have difficult conversation, and so we can get to a place where we're all able to kind of find and, you know, claim our space in the world. And when we thought about, you know, what needs to happen before, and that's the North Star, right? There's a lot of work that has to happen before then. It was not a hard sell at all. And I will say that there are a couple of key reasons for that. One is that we have a board that understands a lot of the social locations. We have leadership that understands some of the issues that are really coming to the fore for Black communities as well as other communities as well. And so it wasn't a big leap, right? There was no big leap for either the board or myself. It made perfect sense. And there was a compelling case with people who had significant experience in philanthropy, as well as the many communities across this country. And the fact that it was also geographically not centered in Toronto was an important part of it for us as well, was the fact that this is this is a national vision, and geographic inequities are also very, very real. And so I think all of those pieces played into it. And of course, you can't have agency without leadership that's actually representative of the communities that you're serving. So I think those are my only other thoughts on top of what Jihad's already said.
Tanya?
For me, it was a little bit different considering I represent an organization with predominantly white leadership. So the conversation, you know, the modern social justice movement made the conversation more receptive. It brought to the forefront more of a common language. People start to understand terms. And then, as Jihad said, you know, the case for support that Foundation for Black Communities built, you know, with that data, you know, we had looked previously for data to support an investment strategy for the Black community specifically, and there wasn't much to be found. So for us, that was a key galvanizer in the conversation. And then some of the own work we did is, you know, early on last year, we made a commitment to dismantle racism within our circle of influence. And for us, this was, you know, the natural next step. And we were able to put in the work, you know, lean on our peers to build that case. And then the board was a lot more receptive because it fit into their natural inclination to serve those in need. And then with the overlay of COVID, those folks that we were serving before were even more disproportionate. So that need grew. And it was easier to connect the dots because the moment we're in to build that case and get it across the finish line.
So I'm going to go right back to the question, and it says, each of your organizations has made a significant investment to FFBC, to the Foundation for Black Communities. I have one more question. How did it impact your long-term vision or your ability to implement your long-term vision? Yeah.
I think it supported it. It enforced that we're on the right track, if you will, internally. And this has, again, as I said before, has taken away absolutely nothing from our ability to continue the fidelity to our strategic priorities that started before this. So we have taken away nothing from other commitments. In fact, this has improved our ability to actually think even more strategically and to focus on communities that have demonstrated greater need and communities that show us the way forward. You know, I think it's a win-win, and philanthropy is advised and will be very smart to take advantage of this moment of inspiration, but moment of real impact, if they want to make a meaningful contribution to something that may have not dipped their fingers in before, this is the opportunity to dive in, because it is a safe investment. If I want to be as crass as this, it is an investment that is absolutely no downside to it, in any aspect.
Sadia, Jihad spoke a little bit about sort of how it aligns with the strategy. Fiscally speaking, any impact, any challenges?
Well, it's interesting. This wasn't part of our strategy. This was a moment in time. And so this is the first capital transfer in the history of the foundation. So it was really, it was a combination of really seizing the moment and with the board being courageous about just saying, there's an opportunity, there's a moment in time where we're called to act, and we're called, and I use that word very, very deliberately, because these are public funds that we hold in trust. And so it wasn't part of the strategy, Liban, to be honest with you. But at the end of the day, that's, as leaders, we are, one of our big things is to lead and to actually seize moments of opportunity as they come along. And in this case, given the mission and vision of the foundation, it was easy to fit it in within that kind of bigger vision. However, no strategy here. It was a moment in time and a moment to really re-examine, rethink. And also, I think I believe very strongly, and I think the board believes very strongly, the money does not belong to us, fundamentally. And if you're just stewards of the money, then I think it was not a hard decision at all for the board, but not part of a strategy. It was purely this moment in time.
Tanya?
For us, it was a combination of our commitment to leading in our sector. And really, it's not so much of a dollars and cents proposition for us. We don't command as much ability to fund as the other organizations, because we're also a grantee. But it's more, how do we use our privileged position? How do we use our platform and ability to share this transition in our business on how to create this equitable, sustainable impact with others to try to galvanize the sector to consider doing business differently? We see that as one of the key drivers to us, and that leadership proposition was very attractive to our board. We put together the case for support of why we want to do this. And a lot of it was, do we want to lead or do we want to follow? As we said, we took advantage of a moment in time and decided to lead. And there's still a ton of room to lead for all those on this call in your communities, within your sector. And I encourage those to do that, because you're still going to be investing in the community as you did before. It's just now going to be a lot more thoughtful. It's going to be with the community as a partner and not just as a recipient. And in the end, the outcomes are going to be deeper and greater. So it's a win-win-win-win-win situation.
So now our next question. So the Foundation for Black Communities, along with the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities and Carleton University, put out a report called Unfunded. Shout out to Counseling Foundation and Lawson Foundation for supporting that important piece of research. In the report, it remarked that as little as 7 cents for every $100 was going to support Black organizations. And a part of that isn't just unwillingness to support Black communities. There are some real challenges and limitations facing the 100+ members of the audience that truly want to, that are taking their time to be here with us today. What are the barriers that you face in supporting Black-led, Black-serving, Black-mandated organizations? And because I'm sure that's something that many folks are also facing and want to think about how to overcome. And as I look at the group audience here, there's 100+ leaders within philanthropy listening eagerly to this question. I'll go with you, Sadia, then we can go to Tanya, then Jihad.
Wow. So the question is really about what are the challenges? Mm-hmm. And I think the challenges are many, especially for smaller foundations. You have small staff. You have limited capacity in some ways, but at the same time, there are also lots of opportunities, and those opportunities present themselves in the form of boards. They present themselves in the form of external advisory committees, in terms of external juries, all of the many ways that many of the foundations who are here today are already working. And I think that sometimes it's really, I get a little bit nervous when we talk about how difficult this is, because I think that's a narrative that we also have to change. It's actually not that difficult. It isn't. And I don't, I think that kind of reinforcing the narrative of how difficult this is not helpful to racialized communities or to Indigenous communities, because it makes it seem like a Herculean feat that very few can actually accomplish. And it's not difficult. And so if we can normalize this as business as usual, you know, but I understand to get to that point, you have to actually deal with boards that are beyond, as somebody asked a question here about diversity of kind of, you know, physical diversity as opposed to diversity of views. And all of that is so important, but you can't find that in one single person or one single board member, which is why you've got 10 different tentacles in which to kind of explore all of those aspects of diversity that feed into equity. And so I don't know, Laban, I guess I'm pushing back a little bit at the question about how difficult this is, because it isn't. It's as difficult as all the other work that we do, no more, no less.
So certainly there are some challenges, right? There's some CRA regulations. There's a lack of relationships. There is the diversity in both physicality and purpose. So you know, I'm sure those are some things that impact the work you did, right, Tanya?
Yeah, we defaulted to CRA regulations for a decade. It's, you know, we only fund registered charities in Ontario. And we would say that all the time. And then we start to become aware, is there a different way? Because so many groups are being left out. And we dabbled a little bit. We didn't go all in the beginning. You know, we partnered with an Indigenous organization to try trust-based philanthropy at a small scale and saw tremendous success, especially with granting to that community. And then when this opportunity became available, you know, I wouldn't say it was a challenge. It was just more a commitment to having those difficult conversations, to educating board members, you know, following up, providing them with the information, and then just getting over the fear that it's not harder, you know, we're not breaking any rules. It's just different. And, you know, as I said, we always used to do things the same, and it worked fine from their perceptions. But once they realized that their perceptions were incorrect, and that there was a better way to do business, it was much easier.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's not complicated. We're making it complicated, because when we use CRA, that's often, in my view, a proxy to saying, well, you are a Black-led organization, you don't meet the criteria of a qualified donee. Therefore, sorry, it's not us, it's CRA. In fact, sometimes I find CRA, as much as I have issues with them, a lot kinder than philanthropy. So I just want to be very clear that, you know, CRA is often a proxy to say no and not take the blame for it. You know, that's not really my case. There are a lot, there are challenges, but those challenges, like Sadia said, can be done and resolved and solved in so many ways. Every aspect of our work is challenging, because you have to be thoughtful, strategic, forward-looking, and making sure that we are meeting all the requirements. So I think it should be straightforward, but we're not. We're making it a lot more complicated. The issue of representation, for me, is key. If there are no voices for the communities that you want to work with around the various decision-making table, thinking table, planning tables, then you are irrelevant. And you're making decisions that feels good to you, but to no one else. And unfortunately, many organizations are happy with that. That's how it's there. And we've been doing it for a number of years. I think it's time to start thinking about it. Let's say, yes, it requires a bit of work. We need to demystify the process and meet board members where they're at and start to really make this as a priority. This is a strategic, smart thing to do. Improve our organizational culture, but maintains our relevance to the public good. And that is where I think we need to start.
Thank you for that. Sadia, it looks like you're right. It's not that complicated after all, apparently. I think, we had one last question, but I think it was really answered in the course of this conversation. And I'm seeing a bit of activity in the chat. So I think maybe this is a nice opportunity to transition to some Q&A from the audience. That way I'll keep my last question in my back pocket in case I have to ask it to fill some of the silence. I hope that's not the case. Kendra, do you want to do us a favor and maybe ping a couple of questions to the panel? And I'm happy to point them out. Or maybe we'll give 30 seconds to the audience for them to submit questions, and then we'll pick from there. How about that?
Yeah, sounds good. We had a couple questions come through as it happened. The first one being, how do you manage the inherent tension between unrestricted granting and the ideas of accountability, especially in relation to government agencies as funders?
I can ask, I'll repeat it one more time, and then I'll sort of put it to our members. Any one of you can answer, all of you can answer, it's your choice. That question again, how do we manage the inherent tension between unrestricted granting and the ideas of accountability, especially in government agencies as funders?
I'll take a stab at it. And I didn't think that unrestricted granting is ineligible. I mean, I think if your grant letter says this is unrestricted, do whatever you like, that's fine. I mean, I don't, again, these things are more of a convenient excuse. I don't think there is anything that tells you as a grant maker, as a funder, whether it's CRA rules or anything, that unrestricted funding is not allowed. I mean, as long as you're clear on the guidelines and on an instruction that this goes for overhead, or the myth of overhead and unrestricted is something also part of the conversation that needs to be better understood and clarified as well.
Yeah, and I would just add to what Jihad just said. Unrestricted granting is not actually that complicated, and we're not seeing any tension in terms of accountability and unrestricted granting. I'll just take the example of the Foundation for Black Communities, the unrestricted granting. There's a pool of monies that are unrestricted, and then there are a pool of monies that are for the endowment. And in this case, it was a one-page letter that says, here's what you said you're going to do. Here's the money to do it. How you choose to do it within what you said you were going to do is up to you. If you needed to build ABC, fine. If you needed to build D, that's also fine, because it still falls within the overall aim of what you said that you needed to do. And we trust that you know what you need to do. So there's no tension for us.
Tanya, you want to give a crack at this, or?
Yeah, just for my context, I think it was just a shift in mentality of, not having to be so hung up on funding something specific. I think in our industry, people love to fund programmatic elements, like fund the books, fund the soccer balls, and the flip charts, but you won't fund the staff. And you're like, well, how does that make sense? Because the majority of the cost of the program would be staff, and then it wouldn't move forward. And then people, I think, always worry about, are my funds going to be used to support something that's not what I want? But again, that just goes back to that old language of what you want is not what the community needs. And it's that transfer of power to serving that need and allowing folks to have that flexibility to meet that need. And things change throughout granting cycles. And it took a while to get people, I guess, to understand that, because it was just so inherent. That's the way you do business, old granting matrices, that's how they were. And folks really understand, like, what is it we're trying to get out of this funding? And does it matter that you need to be fully engulfed in the process of get to that outcome. No, that's their job. That's where trust comes in, of allowing that organization to deliver on the expectations of that funding and giving them the freedom to do so in an efficient way. And you know what? It's okay if that funding helps the overall organization, because that leads to sustainability. And if that's what we truly want, then you gotta consider undesignated funding, because designated funding does not lead to sustainability, because as soon as you pull out, program's over, no impact, and relationship's done.
I want to pull one more thread on this question, and I'm going to ask you guys each 30 seconds, no more, as you respond. Is the tension between unrestricted granting and ideas of accountability, or should we be thinking beyond accountability, thinking about learning? This is an entire sector that has tons of money, near over $85 billion, right, that we can grant to make. The cost of investing in doing good work and doing things new is that you're going to make mistakes and learn. Isn't the learning as valuable as the accountability? Let's go with Jihad, Sadia, and Tanya. 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think it's even more valuable. And I agree. I think, again, these are all convenient ways of gatekeeping. You know, I don't want to disregard and say that accountability is not, it really is. And I think organizations themselves at the forefront of the community, they're most accountable, because they are really dealing with, you know, conditions that are stressful. They stretch their resources, they know their communities. So I think that they have accountability already built in as they really battle the issues on the ground. I think learning is even more valuable, and I don't want to conflate accountability with, you know, that's the only criteria that we need to judge, and because they don't meet it, just move on. It's basically the same argument that many years ago say diversity is a quota and diversity is compromising on quality. We should look at the best candidate. And so it's just the same excuses reinventing themselves in different ways as it is. So
Sadia, Tanya, try to be 30 seconds. I think Jihad was a East African 30 seconds. Let's try to.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Right.
Sadia, you first.
Sure. Yes. I mean, I just come back to the question of who decided what's accountable, and who decided the framing for accountability and what that looks like, not communities. And I know that is an issue that many in philanthropy are thinking very deeply about at this moment. And I'm really looking forward to that question, but also around the question around impact. Who decides what's impactful? And what do we see as impactful? They're actually connected, and those are conversations that are really starting to happen in a meaningful way.
Someone asked this question, and maybe Tanya, I want to maybe see if we can include it. Jihad's talked about a different way of gatekeeping, accountability as cover for gatekeeping. Do you want to maybe comment on that if you can?
Yeah, so it's just, you know, you just default to the rules. And in regards, like, to connect that to learning is, I think people are always worried about what can go wrong and risk instead of what can go right. Instead of, you know, responding and helping the community and giving them agency, it's like, well, what happens if one of these organizations doesn't do what they said they do? And I'm like, well, that happened before under the old regime with our rules, where we made them report through the nose and go through tons of process. It's still the same. And that's like the outcomes, like, to me, it's not that risky. And why don't you try it first? Because we're seeing the same outcomes and thoughtfulness and the partnership we're working through trust-based philanthropy than when we had, you know, tons of forms to fill out and a whole system and this really disengaged, impersonal way of granting. Quite frankly, trust-based has given us deeper stories, deeper relationships, and I'd say a broader circle of impact, because not only are we funding what we want to fund through this process, but also improving a whole community and, you know, making those connections so we can do it better next time.
I think too, Tanya, like a part of, I also come to this work with having run a not-for-profit, where you really are counting every dollar and trying to keep the lights on and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And I think that if those of us in philanthropy can't figure out a way to, with all the assets at our disposal, with some rules around that, if we can't be brave in terms of how we push forward, I think that's hugely problematic, because we're not receiving funds from anybody. We're not beholden to the government. We're not beholden to anybody. And it's a privilege to have this level of independence. And how do we use that privilege?
I'm
Thank you.
gonna tell you a secret. Philanthropy is the least accountable sector. Thank you, Sadi.
So we have a few more questions to get to. I think we could, I wish we had an hour more, and I'm sure others, at least some webinar warriors wish the same. Kendra, can we go to the question from Kisa?
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions coming in just asking about sort of the strategies around making the case for going beyond the CRA. Sort of what are some specific points that you can use to win over your board, you know, your organization representatives, specifically as it relates to sort of more traditional funding organizations. Yeah, let's start there.
So the question was, how do we make the case for going beyond CRA, and where were the specific data points that won your respective boards over? Anyone want to take a crack at that? I won't pick. I'll let you jump in. Tanya?
For me, it was pretty simple in that we weren't able to fund a ton of organizations. So, you know, the unfunded report came out, but then also there was this groundswell in our community here in Toronto of Black-led organizations making their voices heard that they weren't able to access funding because of these restrictions. And then, you know, there's also youth and startups, folks just, you know, getting their feet wet who want to make an impact on their community and are not registered and don't have the capacity to do that. And we're not enabling them to even participate or even start to serve their communities. And that was a very compelling argument that because of this, you know, CRA restriction and not funding unqualified donees, that we didn't even have access to these folks. We couldn't even help them if unless we changed the way we do business.
Anybody want to go next?
Well, we, you know, so Laidlaw Foundation works with youth, focuses on youth and youth-led organizations. And many of these organizations, many of these groups of youth are passionate about the issues they want to advocate for, but they're not thinking about building and establishing an organization to do what they need to do. And often it's an initiative that has a start and an end date that incorporating becomes a distraction. So how do we support? And I don't think CRA would tell you, you know, this is how you do it. They don't have the guidelines, but you can actually build systems. We went to our board and said, we want to focus on youth because you told us to do that. This is the nature. A lot of them are passionate, experienced, connected, and know what needs to be done, but they're not a charity. They're not qualified donors. And the idea of an agency agreement, you know, a trustee organization, there are several options that are all within the CRA rules. Maybe CRA would like none of them, and you don't want to say that they're doing, but you can actually go to your board with a compelling argument to say that this is not going to compromise the quality, the standard, the accountability for us as well, because we're the one accountable. The community is always accountable, and the ways the community actually, we don't lack ways of holding the organization accountable. The communities and the organization lack ways of holding us accountable. So there are ways to internally go to your board with risk mitigation. You have to be very clear about the risk of doing this, obviously. And the more you're clear and transparent, and I think thoughtful strategic boards will come. But again, CRA has rules that is interpreted by everyone that you can't do that. In my view, that we've done a lot of research and study. Yes, we can do this, and we're doing this. We have agency agreements. We show it to the board, and we show that we're not being reckless. Yes, we assume a lot of the risks, but that's the case with every other initiative that we contribute to.
Sadia, did you want to add anything, or
No, I'm happy to go to other questions.
Yeah. The shameless plug on my part. In the call today is Mark Bloomberg, who's been supporting the work that the Foundation for Black Communities is doing, and he often talks about, the limitations of the CRA are self-imposed in many ways for foundations. There are multiple ways for you to be able to do the work in a way that's accountable, but also very impactful. And I know he has a number of series that are posted on his website. If you go to Bloomberg Siegel, so check that out. There's a lot of really great information around how you can be both accountable but also impactful at the same time without necessarily disadvantaging any one particular community, given caution because of an abundance of caution. Kendra, do you want to take us maybe to one last question, and then I want to come back to the panel to close?
Yeah, so the last question we have in the chat is, how can organizations hold funders accountable? How do they push when there's clearly a sort of power imbalance? How do they push for change? Jihad, I see you nodding. Do you want to go first?
I think representation and voices, the best way to hold us accountable is to be able to connect with us and know who to talk to. And having voices around the decision-making table is one of the ways to do this. But also foundations like us need to be accountable in a way that this is what we do, this is how we do it, and this is who we do it with. And that's easier said than done. So it is for us also a learning process. But we're at least open to the conversation around how do we become more accountable, because the more accountable you are, the more relevant you are to the conversation and to the community. And that's.
Yeah, and I know our programming folks often start with the question, what do you need from us? Right? Which is, I think, a really, really important piece in terms of accountability and in terms of, saying like, this is what we need from you. This is what we need from you in terms of reporting. This is what we need from you in terms of framing or not. This is what we need from you in terms of leaning in to other folks in the sector, which we do a lot of actually behind the scenes. We need you to do X, Y, Z. Are you able to do that? And I think that that's a way to hold all of us kind of like we all have skin in the game, right? To use another sports metaphor, that piece of it, when we're all kind of in it based on a relationship that's built on trust, I think is really the strongest way to hold us accountable.
From my perspective, it's an interesting backwards question because, I think it's on us as funders to do the work to be accountable. But for me, it's more of a thank you that when we provide those opportunities for community groups and equity groups to engage with us, that they participate and give us the feedback we need to hear so that we can change. Because without that participation, we're going to maintain our echo chamber and think we're just doing fantastic and move on. And it's when they take those opportunities to be at the decision-making table, when we provide them, that change really happens. So for me, it's more of a thank you to the communities to allowing us to be better and joining us on our journey.
I'm going to quickly close by offering the panel members the opportunity to make, again, 45 seconds of closing remarks. Before I do that, I want to make a quick comment on the last question. And something for us to take away. It's not an answer, but a takeaway. Were our foundations actually designed to be accountable to the public? That's a question I think we should all hold. If we look at our founding documents, what did our membership models look like? Were they open? Were they closed? Were they limited? Right? Were these public dollars, in the way that we design philanthropy, as we think about a shift, were they truly designed to be publicly accountable? Because what we heard a lot of today was a moral outrage, which impacts the changes we're hearing today. But what are the actual structural changes that we need to have in place so that we actually can hold things? There are levers of accountability available. I don't have an answer, but that's something for each of us as leaders in the sector to be thinking about and thinking about deeply. And so finally, I'll ask you in this order of Jihad, Tanya, then Sadia, any closing remarks? And then I'll thank those in attendance today for participating. So take it away.
I'll take less than 45 minutes or seconds. Thank you for including us. And I would just say that I am very happy to share with my colleagues on the call any insight or our experience as Laidlaw Foundation, how we approached it internally, how we talked to the board about it and our advisors, and how we got to where we did. Walk you through our journeys with the Foundation for Black Community and the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, because those are, in my view, they are connected and they address similar issues, historically different, but they really are important. And there are important starting points, and happy to share that with any of you who are thinking about how do I do it and how to approach this with my board.
And I would say ditto to that, and just add that beyond that initial decision to make a capital transfer, there's also what happens after. And so happy to talk about that as well. And as Liban knows, there's been an intense period of also collaboration beyond the actual paper signing. And that is about something much bigger than just a transaction. That is also about the relationship piece. I think the only other last thing I will say is that I'm looking forward to the day when there are more leaders of color and Indigenous leaders and Black leaders within the sector, because I think that it really does matter at the leadership level where decisions happen. It really does matter, and socioeconomic status also matters. And so that's my closing thought.
And
With
just
that,
to-
sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, Tanya, finally you.
Oh, okay, thank you. I was just chiming in anyway. Just to build on what the other two have said, anyone, I work for a corporate private foundation and would like some counsel on how to approach that within a similar environment. Happy to help. And I just challenge all those who are new to the conversation, if this is something you're dabbling in, or the interest is piqued because of what's going on in your community, is think about what your goals of an organization are and what you're trying to fund in your outcomes. And are you doing it the best way with what you've heard today? And try to take some of the learnings of what we talked about and then think about how you're trying to create impact.
Thank you, Tanya, Sadia, Jihad, for your incredible insights and very thoughtful feedback. For all of you, those who stayed throughout the conversation, I thank you for your participation. If you want to get a hold of any of these folks, please don't hesitate. They're on Twitter, they're on LinkedIn. Their websites, their organizations are available. With that said, so much was covered today, but I'll sort of conclude with this one statement that really comes from Tanya. Are we doing what we want, or are we doing what the community's asked for? That, I think, is an important takeaway. And as we think about trust-based philanthropy, that's the space that it holds, right? And I don't think we go wrong by listening to the community. Only thing, we don't fail, we learn, and those learnings are going to help us improve. So with that said, thanks for everyone for participating. Thank you for the leadership shown by the Laidlaw Foundation, Inspirit, and MLSE for putting this event together. And on behalf of the Foundation for Black Communities, it is wonderful to be a part of this journey along with you. And we look forward to not only continuing to work with you, but all those other individuals who are hopefully coming on. And to Jad's point, the Indigenous Peoples Resiliency Fund is an incredibly important initiative. They are essential to the work. Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation go hand in hand, and that's important work. And we encourage you to do your research and learn more about them as well. Thank you so much. And before we leave, can we take a quick photo with the group? No one else has to stay for that part, but Kendra, would you mind? So 1, 2, 3. Thanks so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank
Until we
you.
see each other again soon.